right. Thank you all so much for being here and joining us today. I'm doing tech, and we all wear multiple hats working in the nonprofit world. But we want to thank you all so much for being here today. We're going to share a little bit more information. Just trying to multitask. It's all right. And try and get the clicker to work also at the same time. So Hannah and I, we met about 3 years ago when I started my role at Southern Valley Alliance. She was just getting ready to launch HOF and House of Faith and Freedom, and trying to figure out ways that we can partner together. We're both living in Belle Plaine, so we're basically neighbors, and what can we do to make a difference within our community? And then we met Jess, and just kind of this dream came about, and I really think that it was inspired by the Lord, so we're really excited to be with you here today. Before we dive into our session here, I do want to go over a few acknowledgments. We are here, all of the speakers, we are here to support you and be tools added into your tool belt with all of the wonderful resources that we have. And the content and topics that Hannah and I are about to discuss, and a lot of the content and topics that we're discussing throughout the entire day, may impact or affect individuals differently based on your lived experiences. So if there's any time that you need to get up, step outside, maybe get some fresh air, use the restroom, please take care of yourselves today. We understand that this is a challenging topic to discuss, but we're here to bring this topic to light, break that cycle of abuse, break that cycle of trafficking happening within our community, and have these conversations that are so needed.
Quick note on terminology. If you know anything about the human services field, it's that we love synonyms and acronyms. So for our purposes today, domestic abuse, domestic violence, intimate partner violence, these are all going to be interchangeable terms. I would also like to mention that Katie and I will be using the term victim or survivor when we're talking about someone who has suffered abuse at the hands of a romantic partner, and abuser, perpetrator, or offender when talking about someone who has used abusive tactics. This is not meant to be a form of labeling someone as only an abuser or only a victim. It's just the simplest way to denote who we're talking about in a session like this where we're training. So before we jump into the meat of our session, we thought we would take you beyond the bio. So everything that Jess mentioned about who we are, you can see there's like the bullet points of my bio, but something that is not up there is why I got into this field and why Katie got into this field. And I think when people find out you work in the realm of domestic violence, the question is usually why? Like, this is not the happiest career field. And for most advocates, the answer to that is either personal experience or exposure to someone with personal experience. I've spoken quite a bit on my podcast and in training sessions and in my book on my personal exposure, on the stories of victims and survivors that have driven my career forward, that have impassioned me to continue the work that I'm doing. That said, I do not talk very often about my personal experience. And I think a big part of that is shame, which I feel honestly a little bit ashamed to admit. But I think shame plays a big part when you're a victim. When I was 15 and 16 years old, I dated a guy who was abusive, and I carried a lot of shame about it because I never thought I would be, air quotes, the person to fall prey to that. I came from a family where my parents had a great Christian, godly marriage. I had a very strong friend group. I had a strong sense of self. And so I just didn't think I was vulnerable to that. But the reality is my lack of education, my lack of understanding around what abuse looks like, around the yellow flags, the red flags of manipulation, of coercion, those things made me vulnerable. They made me vulnerable to be taken advantage of. And that is a big driver for why I do the work that I do. It's because when we talk about it, when we educate about it, when we break the silence on issues of abuse and violence, this is where we start to be able to move into the preventative measures and where we can prevent people from ever getting into those situations in the first place.
Yes. Thank you for sharing, Hannah. So very similarly, as Hannah said, something that you don't really see in our bios or see on the screen is our own personal stories. So very similarly, I also have a close personal story to abuse. I saw domestic abuse growing up in my home when I was a kid. I thought that it was normal. I thought that it was kind of what everyone saw when they were at home. I didn't think that it was unique to my family. And just was like, well, this is what the relationship is that's modeled to me. This is my future. This is what I'm going to experience, and just there's that. I didn't have anybody coming into my school or my youth group talking about what a healthy relationship was. Nobody told me that I was worthy of a healthy relationship. I was just like, well, this is my future. And it also kind of ties into, as I was growing up, my mom started taking me to church. I was like in middle school around the time, and so kind of navigating abuse and being a new Christian was really confusing for me. And when it came time for my mom to, disclose that she was experiencing abuse, and she was like, I think that what we're experiencing isn't something that everyone experiences, and we kind of got to get out of this situation. She disclosed her abuse and what we were experiencing to the leaders of our church that we were attending at the time. And they told her to do whatever she could in her power to fix the marriage, whatever was needed for her to do that. And I'm not saying any of this to shame that pastor or shame that church or anything, but to truly raise awareness about the experience that we had. After many more years after that of trying to make the marriage work and seeing that abuse escalate, it came to a point where my mom decided she had to file for a divorce. And because of that, we were no longer welcome in the church. And so that is a huge reason why I'm here today. I so naturally see the perfect place where the church can fit in survivor support. And I know and understand now that church didn't have the resources that they needed to be able to support us. And I hope that we can leave some of those resources with you today in case somebody comes up to you and says that they're experiencing abuse. How can we come together and support those individuals on their journey? So I'm honored to be with you today, honored to be with all of these speakers today, and I'm going to kick us off with diving into a little bit more of what abuse is, DV 101. But before I do that, I do want to share a little bit of information about my organization. So for those of you that live in Scott and Carver counties, we are the domestic abuse service provider for Scott and Carver counties. We've been servicing the area for over 40 years and have assisted over 23,000 individuals as they try to lead healthy, violence-free lives. If you don't live in this area and you want to know who your service provider is, and you're like, well, I haven't heard of them, what does that look like? Please come and see me. I would love to get you connected with your service provider in your area. There is a domestic abuse or sexual assault agency that services every county throughout the state. So diving into a little bit more of the basics of domestic violence. Domestic violence is extremely complex, and we've got a very short period of time to share a lot of information today. This is just the tip of the iceberg. But has anyone heard of the relationship spectrum before? Show of hands. Is this anything people are familiar with? All right, we see a few hands. That's awesome. See not so many hands as well, which I'm so excited you all are here. So the relationship spectrum is a really amazing tool to help us identify the health of any kind of relationship that we have. Every relationship that we have exists on the spectrum from healthy to abusive, with unhealthy relationships filling in that middle ground. In a healthy relationship, these are based on equality and respect. You'll see things like respect, communication, trust, honesty, and equality. In a healthy relationship, you really enjoy spending time together, but you also enjoy spending time apart, being your own individual, not spending all of your time inside that relationship. Unhealthy relationships are based on attempts to control another individual. So we might see things like lacking communication, pressure, dishonesty, those attempts to control and disrespect. In an unhealthy relationship, you kind of feel like you have to spend time with that other individual. Maybe you even feel guilty if you decide to do something without them. And then lastly, there's abusive relationships, which are based solely on having power and control over another individual. Abusive relationships will see things like no communication, and if there is, oftentimes it's usually really harmful. Accusations, blame shifting, isolation, manipulation, and control. In an abusive relationship, you don't really have the choice. You're always spending time within that relationship and with that other person. And if you do have a unique opportunity to spend time outside of that relationship, you don't really feel comfortable talking about what's truly happening within that relationship out of fear of what might happen. Included in your packets today, you've all been given a piece of paper that says 10 signs of a healthy relationship and 10 signs of an unhealthy relationship. This is what my curriculum, when I go into schools and I talk about healthy relationships and warning signs of abuse, this is a core part of that curriculum. Really understanding what should we be striving for in a healthy relationship? What are those warning signs of unhealthy relationships that we can identify and steer towards that healthy side of the spectrum before they escalate to something that is abusive? Healthy relationships should make you feel good about yourself and bring out the best in you. While no relationship is perfect, there's no such thing as a perfect relationship, we can all strive for behaviors that guide all of our relationships towards that healthy side of the spectrum. 100% of us are going to do unhealthy things at times, but we can all learn to love ourselves and those around us better by recognizing those unhealthy signs and choosing healthy behaviors. So let's take a look at what the definition of domestic abuse is. So there are many different terms for domestic abuse. You might have heard domestic violence, intimate partner violence, domestic abuse, family violence. All of these things kind of are all-encompassing and fall under the umbrella of domestic violence. The definition that we're looking at today is specifically defining domestic violence in terms of an intimate partner relationship. But I do want to preface that domestic violence can include any close personal relationship. So anyone from spouses to people who are no longer married or in a relationship, roommates, family members, any close personal relationship. So the National Coalition Against Domestic Violence defines it as the willful or intentional intimidation, physical assault, battery, sexual assault, and or any other abusive behavior as part of a systemic pattern of power and control perpetrated by one intimate partner against another. And I like to kind of take out those last few words and say that it is a systemic pattern of power and control perpetrated by one individual over another. Domestic violence is not just a thrown remote or a hole in the wall or visible bruises. There are many different forms of abuse that extend beyond physical battery. It is a 24/7 pattern designed to exert power and control over another individual to make them feel small, less than, and alone. We could spend an entire 8-hour conference day talking about just specifically the types of abuse. So we don't have enough time to really dive into every single one of these forms of abuse today. I do have resources at our table. If you want to do a deeper dive, I'd love to get connected with you. But I did want to share what a lot of these different forms of abuse look like, because we, I think, are very familiar with physical abuse, maybe even emotional abuse, maybe we've heard of financial abuse, but wanted to share them on the screen here. Emotional abuse can look like any of those non-physical behaviors such as threats or intimidation. Physical abuse is kind of what we think of, those punching, hitting, kicking, but can also be preventing medical care, preventing sleep, preventing you the ability to eat. Sexual abuse is non-consensual interaction through coercion, guilt, or force, any unwanted touch of any kind. Financial abuse involves controlling someone's ability to acquire, use, or maintain financial resources. This is one of the most difficult forms of abuse to be able to see and identify, and it is also one of the forms of abuse that occurs in 99% of abuse cases, so it is extremely prevalent. Digital abuse has been on the rise over the last few years as we've become more connected digitally, and especially on the rise amongst people in their adolescent years, so people under the age of 18. Cultural and spiritual abuse kind of go hand in hand. So cultural abuse can look like when someone uses an aspect of another person's culture, identity, or spirituality to gain and maintain that power and control. And then spiritual abuse when somebody uses religious texts, authority, or beliefs to manipulate, shame, and gain that power and control. I did pair this with an image of the power and control wheel, which is a great tool that we use to help identify and see if that power and control imbalance is in a relationship. And Hannah's going to share a little bit more about that when she speaks. But this depicts a diagram of tactics someone may use to keep that individual within an abusive relationship. We're running out of time already. This is going fast. So I'm going to quickly talk about trauma and abuse and then turn it on over to Hannah here. Experiencing domestic abuse of any kind can be extremely traumatic. Our traditional coping mechanisms don't work, and our body and brains respond to trauma in different ways. What two people might experience the exact same things, and two people are going to respond to it in vastly different ways. So our body will break down trauma in three different ways. We've got hyperarousal, intrusion, or re-experiencing the event, and then constriction and avoidance. So hyperarousal is like our body's physical change that it endures while experiencing trauma. And this can look like, when working with victim survivors, it can look like them being prepared to respond to perceived danger at any time. So maybe they're constantly jumpy or really alert or always on. Then there's intrusion and re-experiencing the event, which a really great example of this would be PTSD. So having that event just have uncontrollable memories, flashbacks continuing to happen after that trauma. And then constriction or avoidance is our brain's way of keeping us safe after experiencing some sort of trauma. So avoiding or ignoring anything related to that trauma. And it's not necessarily a choice that we have, it's just our brain's way of being able to protect us from that. Trauma responses are very normal responses to abnormal situations. I'm going to skip this slide and go into some stats and then hand it over to Hannah. We'd like to think that domestic abuse doesn't happen within our own communities or our own backyards, but the truth is that it is a widely experienced phenomena. It's really sad. 1 in 3 women and 1 in 4 men have experienced some form of abuse in their lifetime. And 1.5 million high school students were purposely physically harmed by a dating partner last year alone. For us, this is why we do what we do. We saw this, we have this personal story, we have this personal journey that we experienced, and we want to say no more. And I know that's why you all are here as well. We can fill Target Field 17 times with just the women survivors in Minnesota that have experienced sexual or domestic violence. This does not include all survivors. So again, an experience that is extremely widespread. And specifically wanted to share and show the faces of those who devastatingly have lost their lives due to domestic violence homicide in the state of Minnesota so far this year alone. We have 24 individuals on that screen. These are the confirmed domestic abuse homicides so far in 2023. Through increasing awareness, training, and building relationships, we can empower victims, educate our youth, inform our neighbors, and partner with agencies, businesses, faith communities, governments, and nonprofits invested in the safety and well-being of our community. Together, we can break the cycle of violence and end abuse in our community. When we think about all of these people that have experienced abuse, victim survivors of domestic abuse are 5 times more likely to seek aid from a spiritual leader, their pastor, before coming to any other organization or professional. Today is all about equipping and empowering your church, your small group, you as an individual, your ministry, your group of friends to have a strong response in place if somebody comes up and discloses that they're experiencing abuse. I'm now going to invite Hannah to come up and share a little bit more about how we can have a Christ-Centered Advocacy within our congregation.
Thanks, Pal. So I want to start out this second portion of our domestic violence session by taking what Katie has talked about around domestic abuse and putting it inside of that faith context. And in order to do that, I think that we need to address why it is that God cares so deeply, so fiercely for victims of domestic violence, and why he cares so much about accountability and justice for those who perpetrate abuse. In 1 John, it says that God is love. Not just that God is loving, but that he literally is love. It is who he is. It is a part of his character. And so it makes sense that in Galatians 5:22, the Apostle Paul writes that the first fruit of the Spirit, the first evidence of a Christ-filled life, is love. Because as we seek to know God more, as we grow deeper in our relationship with him, he begins to transform our mind and our hearts into a closer approximation of his own. We become the likeness of Christ. We see the world as God sees the world. We see other people the way that God sees them. We become this physical, tangible testimony of who God is. In John 13:35, Jesus said, "By this everyone will know that you are my disciples." In other words, here it is. This is the test. If you love one another. Love is the first fruit. Love is the litmus test of our faith. It is the evidence of a Christ-filled life. And very helpfully, the Apostle Paul does not leave us just with this sort of vague understanding of love. Love is a word that changes depending on the culture and the context that it's used in. He gives us a definition. He says, this is the Christ-like love. We see this in 1 Corinthians 13, the sort of classic love chapter. It says, love is patient, love is kind. It does not envy, it does not boast, it is not proud. It does not dishonor others. It is not self-seeking. It is not easily angered. It keeps no record of wrongs. Love does not delight in evil, but rejoices with the truth. Love always protects. This is the fruit. This is the good works, the characteristics that come out of a godly mindset, a godly perception from viewing the world and others through this lens of love, this lens of Christ. However, when we look at the inverse of each of these characteristics of love, we find characteristics of abuse. Abuse is short-tempered and cruel, and it's envious, and it's boastful, and it's narcissistic and humiliating and selfish and critical and vindictive, and it delights in violence. If love protects, abuse harms. Abuse is the opposite of everything that God is and stands for. Abuse is an offense against the very character of God. Abuse is a twisting of love, a twisting of the marriage covenant, a twisting of God's character, and on top of all of that, it is a sin, a violence against God's cherished people. All throughout Scripture, God talks about how much he hates violence, how much he hates oppression. And on the flip side of that, how much he cares for the victim of violence, how much he cares for the oppressed, how he is a stronghold for those who have suffered under injustice. Abuse is this rotted fruit that comes out of a broken and warped and sinful perception. So instead of viewing the world through a lens of biblical and sacrificial love, abusers view the world through a lens of self-love and entitlement. In 2020, this really excellent book came out called When Home Hurts. I'm going to reference it in a second here. But Jeremy Pierre and Greg Wilson, the author of that book, they talk about how abuse always starts with this warped or broken mindset of self over all else. So if we want to talk about a Christ-like mindset, being loving God first and loving people second, abuse is loving self first and God and other people second. Abusers see themselves as the center. They see themselves as the nucleus, as the sun. Darby Strickland, an abuse counselor and excellent Christian writer, talks about abuse ultimately being a sin of idolatry. It's putting yourself above everything else. And this leads to a willingness to use other people to get what you want, to get what you believe that you're owed. Here's the cover for When Home Hurts. In it, they write, "Love is using one's personal capacities to bring about good for others in the world. A person should be considered abusive when he's established a pattern of doing the opposite, using personal capacities to bring about good for himself. This can be called control. To control is to diminish the capacities of others so they're left in a position to conform." So when I train on the power and control wheel that Katie very briefly touched on, I like to use the metaphor of an apple, really sticking with those fruit metaphors. But when I talk about the rotted fruit of abuse, we look at that physical and sexual violence, the outer rim of the power and control wheel, as the skin of the apple. It is the visible outer layer. This is the bruises, this is the lacerations, this is the broken bones, right? This is the very definable instances of physical violence or rape. These are what we can see on the outside of the relationship. However, just beneath that, there's this much broader, wider set of behaviors that make up the bulk of the relational abuse. This is the culture inside the relationship, and ultimately, this is really the bulk of the fruit. And then at the core, at the very center, we see this need for power and control, this entitlement, this self over all else. That is the seed that grew the fruit of abuse. Like all sin, it is thought of in the mind, conceived of in the mind, cultivated in the heart, and it grows out into behaviors. Right? So it starts with the seed, it grows into the fruit. So again, if love is the first fruit of the Spirit of a godly and righteous life, abuse is the fruit of a life lived in opposition to this. It is the behavioral pattern born of a corrupted mindset. And so the reason I wanted to start out our church response section of the session by talking about spiritual fruit is because abuse is the fruit of a very deeply rooted, habitualized sin. It is not a one-off circumstance. Abusers do not just snap, they do not just lose it. It is not the alcohol, it is not because they were stressed at work. When we are talking about abuse, we are talking about a patterned form of behaviors. And when we see something, maybe that visible outer layer, when we see an instance that we can easily identify as abuse, that is coming out of something deeper. That is coming out of the seed. That is coming out of the mindset of abuse. And I think when we talk about how to respond to a victim or survivor of abuse, we first have to understand that they are living under this very specific and repeated form of oppression and violence. And because of this, it is one, more likely to have complex trauma, which Katie touched on, like way more likely to have trauma because it is not a singular event. It's a repeated event over time. And two, it's not going to get better quickly. Abuse is a long-term situation. Recovery from abuse for both the victim and the perpetrator, if they're willing to go through the process of trying to be rehabilitated, that is going to take a very long time. I'm not going to focus on offender rehabilitation today. It's a session for another time. Come talk to me. I have trainings. But those who live under the demands of another person for years have a very specific kind of trauma they're coming out of, and that is who we're going to focus on today. Because victims have been told repeatedly through actions and through words that love looks like abuse. It is the church's responsibility as the carriers, as the physical, tangible representation of Christ, of what love is, to help redefine and reshape what love looks like for these individuals who have been sold a lie about love. I'm going to fly through the information on the second half of this session here. It's really like a 70,000-foot flyover. I have more detailed information if you want to get more training. But I put together another wheel here. And I modeled it off the power and control wheel, but I thought, what if we changed out the seed? Like, what if instead of power and control, we replaced that with Christ-like sacrificial love? What if we replaced it with love and truth? What kind of behaviors would grow out of the church that would create the kind of safe environment, the kind of godly sacrificial love to victims and survivors? So we're going to go over 6 different behaviors that we can use that will make up sort of the bulk of this relationally safe environment inside the church, and all of it should be wrapped in faith community. All of it should be wrapped in the love and care and support of God's people. And the first one is listen. If you take one single thing away from this, take this. Listen. It sounds so simple. But every single dang day, God listens to us. He listens to our prayers and our requests and our laments and our petitions. He listens to our complaints. And so when we listen to other people, we are reflecting God back to them. We're reflecting a form of love back to them and holding space for their stories. There are two specific active listening skills that you can take into the realm of a domestic violence disclosure. And when we say disclosure, we basically just mean when someone starts talking to you and they're bringing up behaviors in their relationship that trigger in your brain, that doesn't seem quite right, or that's very concerning, or it's a past experience of being raped or being assaulted, or whatever it is. When you start understanding someone is telling me something deeper about their relationship here, that's a disclosure. So when we think about disclosures, the first thing is don't overreact. Because when someone discloses to you a personal experience that was traumatic to them, the chances are you are going to feel something. You may feel deep sadness, you may feel outrage, you may feel skepticism, you may feel very uncomfortable, but you're probably going to feel something. And so don't let that emotion bleed out onto your face, into your expression, in an inappropriate manner. And when I say inappropriate, I mean over-exaggerated. Because when you have an extreme response to a disclosure, it is going to do one of two things. It can inadvertently make the victim feel even more overwhelmed, in which now they feel uncomfortable about how extreme your response is. So they're gonna minimize, or they're gonna backtrack, or they may not tell you about more extreme instances of abuse. Or two, it's going to shift the focus off of the victim and onto you. Darby Strickland, I mentioned her earlier, an excellent Christian counselor who specializes in abuse, writes in her book, Is It Abuse? You will have your own way of displaying concern. Express to victims the effect that what they are sharing has on you. It's heartbreaking, and they should know that your heart breaks for them. But be careful. A victim should not be left feeling that she has to comfort you or that her story is overwhelming you. Aim for a balance of showing that you are affected without placing the burden of emotions on her. We are the ones who are asking to bear the victim's burdens. The second is to summarize and clarify. Katie touched very briefly on the reality that abuse creates trauma, and trauma causes neuro and emotional dysregulation. And so this can look like anxiety, it can look like depression, it can look like emotional reactivity, it can look like despondency. Many times when someone is traumatized, they have very poor memory or recollection. And in essence, what this means is that when a victim is disclosing, when they are telling you about their experience of abuse, it's not going to be a well-formed essay. They're not going to be there giving you a perfect speech, a play-by-play of what happened in their lives. They're probably going to start somewhere randomly in the middle. It's probably going to be circular or repetitive. They might miss details. They might tell details out of order. This can lead many people who hear a disclosure to feel skeptical or uncertain about the truthfulness of that disclosure because of the way the victim's coming off, because they come off as sounding unstable. But this is a hallmark of trauma. It is super normal. The best thing that you can do is listen, give them a good long while to get through some of the parts of their story, to wrestle through it, and then summarize and clarify. Summarizing and clarifying does not mean interrogating. It means just say, so this happened and then this happened. Is that correct? Or what I hear you saying is, leave room to help them put these pieces together, but be patient in that process. And then I want to warn you not to undo all of the good you just did by listening, by immediately casting doubt or skepticism on them and their story. Always err on the side of belief. This is something that we struggle with as humans. I think we always want to err on the side of skepticism. And in church settings, this is amplified because you're probably going to know both people. A lot of times when someone discloses to you in church, it is a couple that you have known for years. And if you know the alleged perpetrator, you may have an innate tendency to immediately start to question because your experience does not line up with their experience. But the reality is they live in their relationship and you don't. You're a day visitor. And also, if someone is giving a false disclosure, which frankly speaking is statistically very rare. Victims have very little to gain by coming forward and a lot to lose. That's going to come out eventually. It will become more clear over time. However, if it is a real disclosure, you are dealing with a very dangerous situation that can evolve very quickly. And this leads us to safety. Abuse is ultimately a form of violence, and it can escalate again very quickly with very little warning. I have dealt with plenty of cases where it was all emotional and financial abuse, and then, sorry, 10 minutes. We're really gonna fly, guys. We're gonna roll through this. Where it starts out emotional and then it goes into physical, like very swiftly, especially when someone discloses or comes forward. So this can include physical safety. When we're talking about safety, this can include reports. Does a report need to be made to law enforcement? Are children involved? Does there need to be a report to Child Protective Services? Do they need to leave for a time, a season, or permanently? And in that course of leaving the home for a time, a season, or permanently, or if they're looking to stay, but it's an unstable situation, can you help them walk through a safety plan on how to do that? I have a free download for safety plans. Katie at Southern Valley does safety planning. Literally every domestic violence agency does safety planning. But safety also goes beyond the physical. It goes into the emotional. Because someone doesn't need to be physically harmed or threatened to feel unsafe. Felt safety involves mental well-being and a sense of stability. When we're considering the emotional safety of someone in an abusive situation, you need to consider the kind of environment, the kind of stability, the kind of predictability that you are creating in your interactions with them. And this means giving the victim as much control as possible over who knows their story, when they know it, how much is told, because it allows that victim to control the flow of information. A lot of times that information can get back to their spouse. That can become a dangerous situation and escalate. And it's also about them just knowing what's coming down the pipeline. That adds to a sense of safety. For example, I have worked with several victims where they told or disclosed to someone in the church. That person immediately went to their spouse and confronted them. That was wildly unsafe. Do not do that. I've also worked with victims where they told someone in the church, that person went to the elder board then has them sit down for a big meeting in which 5 to 8 high-powered men sit across the table from one female victim. This is also not an emotionally safe situation when they've been living under the oppression of a male in an authority position. So safety also includes the way that you're engaging. This leads to empowerment. Instill choice whenever and wherever possible. I can't state this one enough because abuse strips away a victim's sense of self. It strips away their identity. It strips away their confidence. It strips away their ability to make choices. And so one of the biggest ways that you can help victims begin to regain their voice and their confidence is by letting them make choices. Allow them to make choices, even very small choices, like where we're gonna sit in the coffee shop we're meeting at, but also the big choices. Allow them the freedom to decide if they feel like it's safe enough to stay in their home. If you're dealing obviously with like a critical incident, that might be a time to say, hey, you really need to leave. But for the most part, instill as much choice as possible. This also means acting as a sounding board instead of as a savior. It is not your job to save a victim. It is not your job to speak on behalf of a victim. It is your job to empower a victim to speak for themselves. A lot of times victims will want you to tell them what to do. Try to resist this urge if you can, and instead lay out the options for them, help them think through and walk through those options, and then allow them to take ownership for their own choices. And as you act as a sounding board, try to avoid these 2 common misconceptions. The first one is treating abuse as a marriage issue. I think a lot of times when we hear a disclosure of abuse, especially when it's in the behavioral realm rather than the physical, we have a tendency to go, oh, that's happening inside a marriage, so marriage problem. We will shuffle you to the marriage counselors. Do not suggest marriage counseling or even put it on the table for someone who is dealing with an abusive relationship. Marriage counseling is not safe for victims. They're essentially gagged in those sessions. They cannot talk about their experience because they will be punished for it later at home. Likewise, do not confuse remorse and repentance. This is a tough one in the church. We all want to see a miracle. We all want to see God magically change someone's heart like instantaneously. And that can happen, of course, but remorse is I'm sorry or tears. It's feeling bad about doing something, feeling bad about getting caught doing something, or feeling bad about suffering the consequences of getting caught doing something. This will often result in short-term behavioral modification. This is where we see a cycle of abuse. We don't have a ton of time to get into that today, but often when an abuser is caught abusing or confronted, they will apologize profusely, or they will justify themselves, or they will explain it away. They'll cry a lot, and then things will get better for a week. Things will get better for a month. Things will get better for 3 months. But eventually, if you do not address the seed, the fruit will regrow. The same rotted fruit. Repentance gets at the seed. Repentance requires an internal shift of the worldview you have. It has to move away from seeing everything self first into God and others first. And the only way that you will truly know if that shift has happened is by waiting for the fruit to regrow. It is by long-term sustained change. I would also suggest building a network and referring to it, because abuse is complex and it is long-term and it is super challenging to deal with, and there will be a lot of different needs, so be a door, not a wall. If a victim comes into the church, 5 times more likely to disclose to a faith leader, be that door. Be the one that connects them to the resources they need. You do not have to do everything. You do not have to walk out of this room and become an abuse advocate. You do not need to walk out of this room and start a ministry for abuse survivors. There are people who have dedicated their lives, their careers to this work. Use that. Build a network. Know who your DV agencies are. Know who your housing assistance programs are. Know what food shelves exist. Know what counselors in your area specialize in abuse, and then refer to them. And another reason this is so critical, and this is our last one here, is that abuse has long-lasting effects. Most people who suffer abuse do so for years. They are under repeated oppression and violence for 10, 20, 30 years sometimes before they realize they aren't suffering a marriage problem. They're suffering an abuse problem. So the reality is, as a church, as an individual, as a ministry, you will be walking with an abuse survivor for years of recovery. Years of recovery. You will burn out if you are the only person. You need to be willing to look at that long-term care and what it takes to sustain it. And so how do we take this today? These are some big concepts, some big trauma-informed concepts that we're talking about here, but how do you take this out of this room in this moment? What are the things you can do before you leave this conference? I'll invite Katie back up.
Hannah, that was amazing. Thank you so much. So we've got, yes, give her a hand. So informative. Thank you. But we've got a few ways that you can take this information beyond these 4 walls today, back into your own everyday life, into your ministry, into your relationships, into your friend groups. Partner with your local domestic abuse or sexual assault agency. So like I said, if you're not in Scott or Carver County, that wouldn't be our organization, but I'd love to get you connected with the one that is in your service area. So please come to the booth after or anytime today. And
get training, guys. Get training. Katie said it earlier. We touched the tip of the iceberg, and it's like nothing. It was so hard to drill down to this. So get training. I offer online training, in-person training, godly response to abuse in a Christian environment. Grace, they're here talking today. They offer training. Southern Valley offers training. Your local DV agencies do. There are a plethora of options. Take advantage of the fact that we are all in one room today. Find out about training.
And break the silence. One of the biggest things that we can do as friends, family members, coworkers of those that are experiencing abuse, those who have survived abuse, is break the silence. Create spaces, safe spaces in your everyday life where talking about abuse can be normal and okay. That's one of the biggest things that we can do. So you already took the first step. you're here today. You've already said yes to the call to making some sort of change within your life to be able to support survivors in your world. So thank you so much for taking that step today. We really appreciate this opportunity to share some more information about domestic abuse in our community with you all. And we are going to be inviting up our next speaker, Jess, to come and join us from Act United. Thank you all so much.